SS Hauptsturmführer Ernst Schäfer was the head of Himmler's expedition to Tibet in 1939. Along with Bruno Bieger, seen here measuring a local's facial features, they conducted experiments, took photos and film, collected artifacts, and brought home to the Reich 120 volumes of the Tibetan Bible, the Kanjur. They carried the ancient Hindu swastika, which in the left-hand version symbolized fortune and health, but in their right-handed version meant decline and death. And they were members of the SS, symbolized by the double Sieg runes, the pagan German letter for victory. They were on this expedition to discover the true origins of an ancient and mysterious race of Nordics, the Aryans, white men from Northern Europe, who had, they believed, conquered and colonized the peoples of India and Tibet. And Heinrich Himmler, who had sent them on this pilgrimage, wanted them to prove that the Aryans had been in these faraway lands, because if these lands used to be Aryan, then the Führer would be justified in reclaiming their rightful living space in the East, and exterminating the lesser races whose blood might contaminate the pure blood of their own and destroy civilization. The explanation for why the events of the Third Reich and the Second World War happened the way that they did, why Hitler wanted to invade the Soviet Union but not go beyond the Ural Mountains, why the Madagascar Plan was even a thing, and where their racism came from, can only be explained if we understand National Socialism. And to do that, we have to take a look at what these people believed. They believed in the Aryan. But what is an Aryan? Where does the word come from? And why did they latch onto this concept so religiously? Well, we're going to find out today. To start this journey into the minds of the National Socialists, we have to go back to England in the late 1700s. Sir William Jones was a respected linguist who understood English, Latin, Greek, Persian, Gothic, and Welsh. And since the East India Company wanted to learn Hindu legal law, they needed someone who could learn Sanskrit. Sir William Jones was the perfect person for this. So Jones was tasked with deciphering the Vedas, ancient Hindu religious texts, the oldest of which, the Rig Veda, was composed more than 2,000 years ago. Well, in 1786, Jones made a remarkable discovery. The Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either. Yet bearing to both of them a strong affinity, both in the root of verbs and in the forms of grammar, than could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong indeed that no philologer could examine them all three, without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. What Jones had discovered was that most European, Middle Eastern and Indian languages had actually all been derived from the same parent tongue. This Proto-Indo-European language fascinated intellectuals across the globe, and linguists were able to piece together this long-dead language through methods explained in the fantastic book The Horse, the Wheel and Language. For the sake of brevity though, I'm not going to go into detail here, but I'll give you an example of how the language evolved over the millennia. The word kuntum was the Proto-Indo-European word for 100. Over the millennia, it evolved into centum, which was how the Romans and Latins pronounced it. From this, we get centum in Old Italian and cent in French and other languages, which is why a cent is 1/100th of a dollar, or why a century is 100 years. But on the other hand, if we go back to cumtum and listen to the first letter, K, K. It's as if there's a H after the K, like a KH, K. Well, back in the day, the K part was dropped by some speakers of the language, and what remained was the H, so it became more like humtum, or hundred, or hundred, which is why 100 means 100, and cent also means 100, because they both came from the same Proto-Indo-European root word. The Rig Veda called the speakers of this ancient language Aryans, and so a new term was born into our language. However, the Rig Veda was written at least 500 years after the language of the Aryans died out, so it's a problematic source to begin with. And it was only applying the term Aryan or Iranian to those who came from the Indo-Iranian branch of the larger Indo-European family, so it wasn't even referring to the entire Proto-Indo-European people. And technically, there's no way to know whether these were a united tribe or even one race or population. There's no way of knowing this. All we know is parts of their language which we can figure out by studying the words we use today. And language isn't race. Many people today speak English even if they're not from England, so the language doesn't tell us whether they were all blonde, blue-eyed Super Saiyans, or if some of them were little green men from Mars. All it tells us is that they spoke a common tongue. But then again, if some of them were aliens, that would explain the pyramids. Anyway, these Proto-Indo-Europeans weren't literate. This is way before the written word, and we're so far back here that we're in prehistoric times. In fact, we're in the Neolithic or Copper Age. And yes, Europeans went straight from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age, but the Middle East and southern Russia went through the Stone Age, then the Copper Age, and then the Bronze Age. It was only after they had discovered bronze that the metal was introduced to the Stone Age Europeans. Well, the Proto-Indo-European language died out about 2500 BCE, 100 or so years before the Bronze Age came to Europe. So this places us squarely in an ancient prehistoric past. But we know that the Proto-Indo-Europeans had copper and then later bronze, not only because they weren't European, but also because of the words they used. They had words for horses, and so this rules out the Middle East because horses were basically non-existent there at this time. They had words for beekeeping, so we know that they didn't come from beyond the Ural Mountains because there are no honeybees in Siberia, nor in the Central Asian steppes of Kazakhstan. We also know they were farmers and animal breeders, not hunter-gatherers, which means that the northern forests of Europe are excluded, and we can rule out Europe anyway because the Proto-Indo-Europeans had words for copper and bronze, which the Europeans hadn't discovered yet. Thus, by going through all the words, we can narrow down the location of the Aryans to the steppe region south and west of the Urals and north of the Caucasus. This was the Aryan homeland, not Central or Northern Europe. And I do find it ironic that it was in this Aryan homeland that Hitler's armies broke down and were defeated in 1942, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back in the 1800s, there was a lot of fascination with this ancient tribe of supposed white men who conquered northwestern India, even though the Rig Veda states that the leaders of the Aryans were non-Aryan, therefore proving that they weren't as genetically pure as some later believed. Nonetheless, it moved beyond the world of linguists and archaeologists to a world of nationalism, politics, and religion. Herder and later von Humboldt decided that language distinguishes us from other speakers and creates communities, or folks. Nationalists then hijacked Darwin's natural selection idea to explain why some races, or folks, ruled over others and why some were more fit than others. Lesser races were deemed to be contaminations of the national body who dilute the superior qualities of the higher races. These ideas were embraced by the German speakers in Central Europe, especially those in the multi-ethnic Habsburg Empire. Many wanted a pan-German empire that included all the little states of Germany plus the Austrians. However, this was dashed after 1866 when the Prussians defeated the Austrians in battle. Nationalist and racist tensions rose further when the Hungarians were granted political independence within the state in 1867. The Austrian-German nationalists now wanted Austria to split from the Habsburg Empire and join the new Second Reich, which had just been forged in 1871 without Austria. This failure to unite all the German speakers frustrated many nationalists in both countries, whose reaction was to increase the intensity of their pan-German theories. German imperialism was late in coming, but it was founded on envy of other empires, and as a consequence, was more ruthless. We have to remember that these people were also in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, where traditional roles and values were being replaced by new ones, and massive social changes were occurring. Germany and Austria were latecomers to this industrial world, with pre-capitalist attitudes and institutions surviving and despising modernisation. There was an anxiety over all of this, with many reacting by trying to align themselves with the past. Racism therefore emerged, and to sum up the feeling of many Germans and Austrian Germans at this time, they felt like they were under attack from the other races around them, especially the Slavs, who they believed were encroaching on their culture. Riots eventually broke out in 1891, threatening to plunge the country into civil war. The underlying theme of these varied political protests was the attempt on the part of many Austrian Germans to fight a rearguard action against Slav demands for political and national expression and unity within the increasingly anachronistic multinational Habsburg Empire. I just want to emphasise this. Austrian-German racist nationalism was a reaction to a perceived attack on their culture by other nationalities within a multi-ethnic empire. Whether that attack was truly there or not isn't the point. What matters is that the more the state and the powers that be called for unity and inclusivity, which is anti-national by nature, the worse the reaction became. Intense internationalism drove people into the nationalist camp, eventually resulting in two of the biggest wars in history and the destruction of millions of people in the following decades. Maybe there's a lesson we can learn from that. Anyway, the origins of the German völkisch nationalist movement emerged from the Theosophy religion, which was created by a Russian mystic called Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. In her books, she ranted against the rationalist and materialistic culture of modern Western civilization, thus appealing to the German nationalists, and studied Indian law, focusing on the Sanskrit and Aryan languages. Her great-grandfather had been a Rosicrucian Mason and had accumulated a large library of occult works. He had belonged to the Rite of Strict Observance, a German society which claimed to be in contact with unknown superiors. Helena spent many hours studying in her grandfather's library and would later invent her own superiors. She mixed science with pseudoscience and spirituality and went on to write a book called The Secret Doctrine in 1888. This outlined the activities of Fohat, a god from the universe's creation until its end, which she said was also a cyclical process. Ideas like time, space, and matter were symbolized by a series of sacred Hindu signals, one of which was the sun cross. The entire cosmos, Blavatsky said, was created by the solar and electric energy of Fohat, and that this cyclical nature of the cosmos would result in 7 consecutive root races who became progressively superior as they emerged. The first race was the astral race, who came from the sacred land. The next were the Hyperboreans, who came from a polar continent. The third were the Lemurians, who came from a continent that had once been in the Indian Ocean. The fourth were the Atlanteans, the same ones destroyed when their city flooded. And their fifth race were the Aryans, which we modern humans are all a part of. She also said that some of the Atlanteans had fled the collapse of their civilization and had taken refuge in the Tibetan kingdom of Shambhala, where they passed on their wisdom to the Aryans, who then moved west. Now, there are origins of some of this stuff in ancient texts. Hyperboreans were mentioned by some ancient Greek authors, but otherwise, most of this stuff is just made up. And Blavatsky's mental health was called into question, resulting in the collapse of her society, although the religion later re-emerged. Nevertheless, Blavatsky's work actually had a major impact in Germany and Austria for various reasons. It ended up being adopted by Guido von List, who combined it with völkisch ideology and twisted it to suit what he was trying to say. List had originally been a Roman Catholic, but in 1862 he and his father went into the catacombs beneath St. Stephen's Cathedral. He believed that this labyrinth was a pre-Christian shrine dedicated to a pagan deity, so he knelt down at a ruined altar and swore to build a temple to Wotan. He therefore converted from the Christian faith into a neo-German pagan faith, writing books about German history and heritage which appealed to German nationalists. List claimed that the ancient Teutons had practiced a Gnostic religion emphasizing the initiation of man into natural mysteries. He called this religion Wotanism, after the principal god in the Germanic pantheon. His basic sources for the ancient religion were the Edda and the runes. He took Blavatsky's works and just changed some of the names of the previous races to mythical Teutonic names. He also claimed that the prehistoric structures in Lower Austria were evidence that the Atlanteans had survived on the European continent, not just in Tibet. In other words, List had just Germanized theosophy, and founded the List Society in 1904, publishing pamphlets about his ideas, and called himself the Grand Master of his order. His followers also had similar ancient priestly titles. Oh, and List sometimes fell into a trance and was able to see events of the past. And people just believed him. He had effectively founded a new religion which was opposed to the modern world. It revered a pan-Germanic globe and tried to place the power of the individual spirit within the cosmos of nature. And you might ask, but why would the nationalists believe in this stuff? It's not rational, is it? And the answer is, because the real world didn't conform to what they wanted, so they turned to fantasy. If nationhood could not be achieved in the real world, then it could at least be imagined. Germans became a nation in their heads, and the world they saw there was aggressively exclusive. List borrowed from the Christian and Jewish faiths and predicted that Austria would collapse, saying that the German language and culture in Austria was being undermined by the Slavs. List disliked how capitalism and large-scale enterprises resulted in the destruction of the traditional trades, and bemoaned the decline of the medieval guilds. He despised modern banking and usury, wanting to return to a pre-capitalist mode of financing commerce. List sought a more concrete personification of these widespread socio-economic transformations in the monolithic conspiracy of the Great International Party. He said the Great International Party could be discerned in the financial institutions, the political parties, and their neglect of German national interests, and in the advocates of emancipation, reform, and international cooperation. List demanded the annihilation of the Great International Party in order that the Aryo-Germans could enter the promised land of happiness and prosperity. He also said that the years 1914, 1923 and 1932 were going to be incredibly important because divine forces would possess the German people and usher in revolutions that would transform society into a monolithic and eternal structure. And he was wrong. But nonetheless, many of List's ideas ended up forming the basis of the ideology adopted by the Thule Society and of course the Nazi Party. List's blueprint for a new pan-German empire was detailed and unambiguous. It called for the ruthless subjection of non-Aryans to Aryan masters in a highly structured hierarchical society. Then we have Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels, a contemporary of List, who was also a liar and claimed he was born in a different year than he actually was, to a baron rather than a school headmaster like he actually was, and later claimed that he met Hitler in 1909 and that Hitler read his works, which he may have done, but there's a few problems with that theory. It's not worth getting into that debate today because regardless, the ideas Lanz put forth had a major influence on National Socialist ideology later. Lanz claimed that the blonde, blue-eyed Aryans were the good superior race, and the other darker races were the evil ones, and that they were cosmic entities of order and chaos. He claimed that the primary purpose of the Old Testament was to warn Aryans not to breed with the lesser people, and that the lesser races should be exterminated through sterilization and castration. It is through Lanz that we get the idea to deport the Jews to Madagascar. And no, it wasn't an idea born of the 1930s, as many have claimed. It was Lanz who came up with the idea prior to the First World War. The Nazis borrowed this idea later, showing how important Lanz was to them. Himmler also borrowed Lanz's proposals for maternity organisations where stud males would breed with blood mothers to have plenty of children for the race. And yes, Lanz still believed in the idea of Atlanteans and the root races and all that good stuff, so he was completely off his head, and it was Himmler who was reading his texts. Now, there were various other writers and intellectuals in the late 1800s and early 1900s who were writing that the Aryan race would be destroyed by an ocean of black and yellow races, and that the Aryans' greatest enemy was the Jews. There's too many to mention here, but a few notable names were Houston Stewart Chamberlain, whom Hitler had read, Eugen Fischer, and Georg von Schunerer, who seems to have united a lot of the concepts together into a political force. We also have Karl Haushofer, who said that the Indo-German peoples needed more living space, a concept Rudolf Hess introduced to Hitler in prison when they wrote Mein Kampf. However, by the time we get to the early 1900s and First World War period, the völkisch religion had reached its pre-Nazi peak under the guide of Theodor Fritsch, who created a new anti-Semitic lodge organisation in 1912. There was a nice ceremony for new members. The ceremony began with soft harmonium music while the brothers sang the Pilgrim's Chorus from Wagner's Tannhauser. The ritual commenced in candlelight, with brothers making the sign of the swastika and the master reciprocating. Then the blindfold novices, clad in pilgrimage mantles, were ushered by the master of ceremonies into the room. Here, the master told them of the order's Aryo-Germanic and aristocratic Weltanschauung, before the bard lit the sacred flame in the grove and the novices were divested of their mantles and blindfolds. At this point, the master seized Wotan's spear, which is definitely not a euphemism, and held it before him, while the two knights crossed their swords upon it. Did they really? A series of calls and responses, accompanied by music from Lohengrin, completed the oath of the novices. Their consecration followed with cries from the forest elves, the choir, as the new brothers were led into the Grove of the Grail around the bard's sacred flame. These particular Germanenorden lodges collapsed during the war, but were revived afterwards, and it was some of these lodges that assassinated various Jewish and Weimar enemies, including the Reich finance minister who signed the armistice, Matthias Erzberger. Then we get to Rudolf von Siepottendorf, who wasn't actually born a noble and whose real name was Adam Alfred Rudolf Glauer. But Siepottendorf established the Thule Society during the First World War, and the name was from a northern land discovered by Pytheas in 300 BC, and Siepottendorf believed it was Iceland. Here's what Siepottendorf said the day after the German Revolution began. Yesterday we experienced the collapse of everything which was familiar, dear and valuable to us. In the place of our princes of Germanic blood rules our deadly enemy, Judah. As long as I hold the iron hammer, I am determined to pledge the Thule to this struggle. Our order is a Germanic order. Loyalty is also Germanic. Our God is Valvater, his name is the Arun, and the Trinity, Votan, Vicky, V, is the unity of the Trinity. The Arun signifies Aryan, primal fire, the sun and the eagle. And the eagle is the symbol of the Aryans. In order to depict the eagle's capacity for self-immolation by fire, it is coloured red. From today, our symbol is the red eagle, which warns us that we must die in order to live. The Thule took part in fighting the Red Army in Bavaria during the revolutions there, fighting with Kampfgruppe Epp when Epp entered the city. Anton Drexler and Karl Haarer were also members of the Thule Society, and with Subottendorf created the Deutsche Arbeiterverein, which was a small group where Haarer could lecture the others on various topics. It was from this that Drexler decided to form a political party, which he did formally on the 5th of January 1919. This was the Deutsche Arbeiterparty, German Workers' Party, the DAP, the forerunner of the NSDAP, the Nazi Party. Subottendorf was kicked out of the Thule Society in June of 1919 for losing a list of members killed in the fighting, so Hitler didn't actually meet him when he first discovered the party on the 12th of September 1919. But the foundation of the Nazi Party had been established by Subottendorf, Drexler and Haarer, and the legacy of all that we've discussed so far now moves into Nazi ideology. After innumerable trials, I decided upon a final form, a flag of red material with a white disc bearing in its centre a black swastika. We National Socialists regarded our flag as being the embodiment of our party programme. The red expressed the social thought underlying the movement, white the national thought, and the swastika signified the mission allotted to us, the struggle for the victory of Aryan mankind, and at the same time the struggle of the ideal of the creative work, which is in itself and always will be anti-Semitic. So the reason Hitler chose the swastika was because a bunch of mystics thought that Aryans might have been in India. Well, I've covered Hitler's ideology in detail in my Hitler's Socialism video, so I'll link to that at the end of this video and would recommend watching sections 4 and 5 for the ideological ideas Hitler expressed. There's timestamps in that video's description for those sections, but the ideological foundation for National Socialism is based on an anti-Christian, especially anti-Catholic, racist religion that sees Christianity as a Jewish evil that had reduced the German people to slaves. They were against the Freemasons, were anti-Semitic of course, and were pan-German, believing that the Aryan Volk was mystical and superior to all others. And the general idea was that the Aryans had come from Germany or the Nordic region of Northern Europe and had moved east to India, with some believing that an Aryan society still existed in the Himalayas, which is why Himmler was sending Ernst Schaefer on an expedition to Tibet. I will point out though that Hitler didn't believe in everything I've mentioned so far. He didn't actually believe that there were Aryans in Tibet like Himmler did. And I can't see evidence of him agreeing with the theories of Hyperboreans and some of the more outlandish stuff like that, although he may have actually believed in reincarnation just like the Hindus do. The elements of which our body is made belong to the cycle of nature, and as for our soul, it's possible that it might return to limbo until it gets an opportunity to reincarnate itself. But Hitler definitely believed in a lot of what Hans Günther, the race pope, had to say. Hitler had appointed him to the position of chair at Jena University and attended Günther's first lecture in the 1920s. Günther wrote about the Nordic race as well as 4 other previous races, because yes, he was a mystic as well, and the dangers of mixing blood with the eastern neighbours. It was from the race pope that Hitler got the idea that Aryan blood is what builds nations, and when Aryan blood is mixed with lesser peoples, civilization collapses. So Hans Günther was highly influential on Hitler and Himmler and many other National Socialists as well. But it was all garbage. There's no evidence for any of what Günther or any of these other guys believed. It's all just superstitious nonsense. And this is why National Socialism should be classed as a religion. Everything that these guys believe is based in belief. Belief that because of our language and the words written in some Hindu texts, that there was a race of Super Saiyans that came from Germany, descended from a race of giants in Hyperborea, of course, based on the belief that the blood is somehow magical, the belief that there were different races and that only those with pure blood can build nations. It's all made up, right? They call themselves scientific, but there's no scientific basis for any of it. And yet they took these concepts and somehow convinced a lot of people that they were right and proceeded to turn their nation into a war camp and then murdered a lot of people. So it's no wonder that people are baffled by what happened. But it gets worse. We're not done yet. And now we're going to take it to the next level and talk about Heinrich Himmler and his beliefs regarding all of this. Himmler subscribed to Hans Günther's theories, and even though he had been a Catholic in his youth, he read books on the Jewish roots of communism and was persuaded to drop Christianity, thinking it was just Jewish superstition. Instead, the Germans, he believed, had to rediscover the pagan gods the church had suppressed. So Himmler read the publications of the German Theosophical Society and absorbed their occultist theories on race, runes, swastikas, pan-Germanism, anti-Semitism, and of course shared the same views as Rudolf Hess on ancient polar civilizations and the Aryan master race. As one of Himmler's men described him, the usual view of Himmler is that he was an ice-cold, cynical politician. This view is almost certainly wrong. Himmler was a mystic. In 1935, he created the Anaerbe with Richard Walter Darry, the blood and soil advocate, and tasked the institution with finding the origins of the German race by delving into German prehistory and archaeology. The race pope had told him that the Hindu Veda scripts were in fact written by ancient Nordics, but that the further the Nordics had gone east, the more their blood was corrupted by the lesser races. However, Günther still believed that there might be an enclave in Tibet which had some Aryan blood left, so Himmler sent an expedition there. This also tied nicely into the world ice theory that Hans Günther had written about and that Himmler also believed in. According to Günther, the matter of the universe was made up of ice, and that every planetary body was made of ice. This ice struggled against fire from the stars, and this struggle caused planets and moons to crash together, creating all sorts of weather problems. These weather problems caused the extinction of the dinosaurs, explained why the biblical flood happened, and why Atlantis was flooded and sank. Well, Günther also said that refugees from Atlantis may have survived in parts of the world, like Mexico, South America, and of course, Tibet. The Welteis-Lehre provided an Aryan alternative to the dreadful and mistaken Jewish theories of scientists like Einstein. Even the usually skeptical Hitler embraced glacial cosmogony. And, as said previously, if Himmler could show that the Aryans had been in a particular area before, this land used to be ours, then the Germans could justify reconquering that land. We want it back. This was the case even if it had been thousands of years since the Aryans had supposedly been there. So this was partly why he latched onto the world ice theory and similar. It was about territorial claims as much as him being completely off his head. But theories weren't enough. He needed something more concrete. So he sought the psychic services of Karl Maria Willigut, nicknamed the Rasputin of Himmler. Willigut had joined the military in 1884, fought in the First World War as a colonel, and retired on the 1st of January 1919. And I'm not sure if the First World War damaged him psychologically or whatever, but he started to say some really weird stuff. Willigut's subsequent importance to völkisch groups and the SS rested on his reputation as the last descendant of a long line of Germanic sages, the Uligotis, of the Asa Una Sippa, which dated back to a remote prehistoric era. Willigut claimed to possess ancestral clairvoyant memory, which enabled him to recall the history and experiences of his tribe over thousands of years. Willigut said that his ancestors could trace their lineage to the ancient air and water gods, and that the pagan Saxons were suppressed by Charlemagne in the 9th century, which is why Christianity took over the pagans. Until now. His chronology of prehistory began around 228,000 BC, when there were 3 suns in the sky and the earth was populated with giants, dwarves, and other supposedly mythical beings. History proper began for Willigut when his ancestors, the Alder Willigoten, helped restore peaceful conditions after a long period of strife and thereby inaugurated the Second Bozo culture, which witnessed the foundation of the city Arol-Juravalas Goslar in 78,000 BC. Subsequent millennia were described in a detailed record of tribal conflicts and mass migrations to fabulous continents of theosophical tradition. In other words, this guy was a German Tolkien, except for much more entertaining. His wife provided him with 2 daughters, but his son died in infancy. Willigut therefore fell out with his wife because only a son could carry on the ancient and mystical Willigut line, apparently. His wife also wasn't happy that he was wasting his money on publishing a newspaper to express his views on his ancestry, and so arguments ensued. Apparently he got violent, and then one day in 1924, men in white coats came along and took him to the Salzburg mental asylum, where he was certified as insane in 1927. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and paranoia, as well as a host of other delusions. However, he remained in contact with the other members of the völkisch movement and came back to be a sage after his release. And Himmler got to hear about this guy, and thinking that he was a source of wealth about the ancient past, decided to trust Willigut and made him the head of an SS department for pre- and early history within the Race and Settlement main office in Munich. Willigut, now called by another name, but I'm going to keep calling him Willigut, became a colonel, SS Standartführer, and then an SS Oberführer, and was the guy who designed the SS Totenkopf ring, given for tens of thousands of members of the SS. The double rune group with the 2 SS lightning bolts and up-pointing arrow indicated the traditions of the Willigut ancestry. When Julius Evola, the oddball and only racist in the Fascist Party of Italy, started talking about Hyperboreans, stuff I mentioned in the Fascism Defined video, Willigut was the guy who determined that Evola was ignorant of the prehistoric Germanic institutions and their meaning, and thus the SS ordered that Evola's activities in the Reich should be discouraged. Yes, Madman Evola was out-madmanned by Madman Willigut. But in November of 1938, Willigut's wife let the authorities know about Willigut's previous admission to the Salzburg mental asylum, and Himmler, now deeply embarrassed, forced Willigut into retirement. He was given an SS pension, but his health soon caught up to him. Karl Maria Willigut died on the 3rd of January 1946, the last of his secret line. And if you've made it this far into the video, you might be thinking, okay, science has come a long way since the 1930s and 40s, so nobody could believe any of this stuff today, right? Oh no, you would be wrong. Ernst Zundel, the guy who commissioned the Leuchter report, and the founder of a neo-Nazi publication house, took the idea of lost colonies and decided that they weren't in Tibet or the Arctic. No, they were in Antarctica, which is why there are now secret Nazi bases there. And we obviously have the theory that the Antarcticans, Homo sapien 1.52, are living in Antarctica and will invade New Zealand to purchase cheap houses with counterfeit currency, most likely the euro. So, these ideas are still around to this day, and it seems that, because of the industrial and scientific revolutions and other factors, traditional religion has been in trouble and on the decline. And humans are not purely rational robots. They are emotional creatures who need faith in something, either because a higher power does exist or because they need comfort and purpose in life. Regardless, they're flocking to cults like nationalism, racism, socialism, and various other ideologies to fill the hole left by the orthodox faiths. And a portion of these people are coming up with their own theories and beliefs about Hyperboreans, Antarcticans, little green men, and so on. Some people might say that this is a psychological issue, and maybe some of these people genuinely need therapy, but fundamentally this is a crisis of belief. And as this video shows, it's been going on since the late 1700s at least. Nazism, fascism, Marxism, all these isms claim to be scientific, but in reality are all religions and cults. They were all born out of this crisis of faith. I mean, just look at the leaders. Hitler, Himmler, Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mussolini, they all went to religious schools in their youth and then later renounced the faith. Hitler even considered becoming a priest at one point. And anti-Semitism, which all these guys had their hands in to some extent, Mussolini less so than the others, is obviously born out of the religious conflict of the past. Advocates of these religions believe that if only we could have a revolution, we can cross over to our new Jerusalem, be that communism, a 1,000-year Reich, or whatever. The point of all this is to say that everything I've covered today may seem like nonsense, and to us it is, but to these people they genuinely believed it. They were the founders of new religions, shepherds of the flock, and they weren't coming up with empirical scientific theories, they were writing religious texts which evolved over time and became the source of an ideology responsible for a lot of death in the 20th century and beyond, it seems. So, as much as we would want to do otherwise, we need to recognise that National Socialism, Fascism, Marxism, and so on are religions. They were fighting holy wars, and in their minds, they believed that what they were doing was right. I must give credit where credit is due. I relied heavily on 3 books in this video: The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, Himmler's Crusade, and the Occult Roots of Nazism. The first one is a great read if you're interested in the prehistory and language of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Occult Roots is very good, but also highly academic, so might not be for everyone. And if you just have to pick one, I'd say Hale's book provides a nice balance between the two, as it's a nice read and also covers the important points. I will link to my Hitler Socialism video and remind you, if you haven't seen it already, to at least watch sections 4 and 5 to understand Hitler's ideology. Timestamps are in that video's description. Thanks for watching, bye for now.